Hi, the bond markets seem to be in a spot of a bother. The government is borrowing more. The RBI does not want rates or interest rates to go high for the borrowing, but the bond market uh, is putting upward pressure on yields. This is quite a complex game that is going on. I don't know if game is the right word, but complex dynamics that are going on in the financial system right now. And some experts and analysts think this is ominous. This is an indication of how things might get tough for the government, tough for the bond markets, tough for RBI, which has to balance the interests of the government and the bond markets and interest rates and consumers like you and me. So what exactly is going on? We have Professor Ila Patnaik back with us today live to explain this. What is quite a complex subject. I'm YP Rajesh, managing editor at ThePrint. And for viewers who are our regular viewers, we took a break last week and we are back this Friday because Professor Patnaik took her COVID shot last week and had a bit of a temperature and all of that. She's fine now, back with us. So Ila, without further ado, nice to have you back with us. Uh, why is the bond market worried? What exactly is worrying the bond market? And you should explain it to all of us because this is not something we tackle on a regular basis.
Keep the cost of borrowing of the government low. While that's something that as a debt manager it would like to do, but when the amount that it wants to borrow goes up, then the price at which people are willing to pay, the price at which people are willing to lend that amount, which is the interest rate, also goes up. There's an upward pressure on interest when you want to borrow more and more. So you have a limited supply of savings and to in the economy, and so to get more for the government, ideally, not ideally in terms of the economy, but I'm just saying in terms of market clearing, unless the amount of liquidity in the economy went up, what you would find is that the price goes up. So, in other words, when the government borrows more, there is upward pressure on the interest rate that the government has to pay. But with the RBI trying to keep that rate low, the way the bond market functions is that it does an auction. It says, okay, I'll be willing to sell these many bonds if people are willing to accept it at. I'll just use the word interest rates because I don't want to get into the yield and trying to explain the technical jargon. So let's just keep it to the rate of interest, effectively what people are willing to borrow that money at is actually uh, more than what the RBI is willing to pay. The RBI willing to pay on behalf of government. And then so the RBI says, oh, that's a failed auction. I don't really want to pay this much interest rates. I'll only pay less. And then it asks the primary dealers, the ones who do the selling for the RBI in the market, to actually buy that debt itself, buy that paper, buy those bonds themselves. So that's the kind of thing that happens when the government borrows more than what people want to lend to it at given interest rates. So, of course, people will be willing to lend more to the government if the government was to pay a higher cost. And that's what is happening. So, there are these contradictions currently where at the moment, you do want more borrowing by the government, but you also want to keep interest rates in the economy low. Currently, when inflation is low, when activity is low, when we are going, just picking up momentum out of the pandemic, then we want to keep interest rates low. Whereas the bond markets are putting upward pressure on interest rates. So that's the dilemma of the day.
And you've written your column this week, published on theprint.in. We will be sharing the link in the description of this video, after this video. Uh, when you talk about various things the RBI has been doing to balance this, like, keep rates low, at the same time, not, allow inflation to climb, make it easy for the government to borrow. What exactly has the RBI been trying to do, or how has it been trying to manage this situation?
So, what the RBI has done is what are called open market operations. That is, that it wants to put liquidity in the system so that in general interest rates remain low. And when it does open market operations, it buys bonds and puts liquidity in or cash in the hands of people. When it is buying a bond, then liquidity is going to banks. And hopefully, when banks then use that liquidity, they keep interest rates low. So, broadly, today there was news that Christine Lagarde, who's the president of the European Central Bank, has said that they will also do open market operations. They will also pump liquidity into the system, because this is not just the Indian government which is borrowing more and pushing yields up, but it is, and putting upward pressure on yields, but it is, or interest rates, let's call it, the cost of its borrowing. But it is every other government who's facing a similar situation. Because of the pandemic, governments have had to borrow, they've had to borrow more. And for them to be able to borrow more, the cost of their borrowing is seeing an upward push. So, to counter that, to bring that cost down, central banks are pumping liquidity into the system.
But you also write, Ila, that the markets are not convinced. Why is that?
Yeah, because the amount that is being borrowed is high and is likely to continue to be high for the next 3 years or so, when the central bank has already announced that it will have a higher than FRBM target. So it will be borrowing 4.5% of GDP and not a lower amount. So, just if you contrast the two situations, one in which it was earlier when the total amount of borrowing was less, and now when the amount of borrowing is more, then clearly the cost is going to be higher in the second situation. And if the government and RBI are not willing to pay that cost, then the market will not be convinced. The market will not want to borrow a larger amount at a lower price.
I have one more question, Ila, before we go to our viewers and take viewers' questions. So I'm asking viewers to send in our questions. I know this is a complex topic, and Ila is best placed to answer these questions. My last question to you, Ila, is the complex balancing game which the RBI is trying to play, and you say that it's not a easy game or easy process to for the RBI to deal with, and that the RBI should be relieved from its debt management duties to handle bond market issues. Can you explain that?
So, when countries move to inflation targeting, then one of the things that happens is that you're telling the central bank that in case inflation starts rising, you need to use the policy rate or interest rates. You need to raise interest rates if inflation is rising to be able to keep inflation within the target or the band in our case. Almost all countries, when they move from a central bank that does many things to becoming a central bank that does inflation targeting, they have given up their debt management function. So if you look at the UK, for example, the Bank of England used to be the debt manager, but after it moved to inflation targeting, it set up a separate debt management office. The reason that is done is precisely for situations like this, when as a debt manager, the central bank is trying to keep the cost of borrowing low, that which is to keep interest rates low, while as an inflation targeter, in case prices start rising, say so commodity prices are rising, oil prices are high, let's say demand picks up and prices start rising, then in its role as the monetary authority, it would have to raise interest rates. So there's a conflict there. Should it raise rates to control prices, or should it keep interest rates low to keep the cost of borrowing for government low? Because there is that conflict, other central banks have usually given up their debt management function because they are primarily the monetary authority. Debt management can be done by somebody else. Debt management of the government can be done by somebody else. So in India also, it was proposed that we would have a public debt management agency, which would be an independent manager of the government. So when in 2016 we moved to an inflation targeting central bank, the plan was that at the same time the government would you know get its own independent debt manager, so that RBI is relieved of this conflict, because it will have this conflict in any situation when it is expected to raise rates. The only time that conflict doesn't happen is when it can lower rates, so when there is low inflation. But since that's in business cycles, you face both situations. So half the times RBI will have that conflict, and that is why my co-author Radhika Pandey and I are arguing in this column that RBI, bring back the agenda of having an independent debt management agency and relieve the RBI of this conflict of interest.
Ela, we'll take some questions from our viewers, but before that, I have an appeal to our viewers. All of you who have been watching this know that we bring you some very simple explained economics, some insights which Ela is such an expert on, and then we have so many other shows which give you similar insights on politics, on defense, on government matters, and all of this costs a lot of money, and we need to sustain this. We need people to come to us and get what they want in terms of news and analysis and views and opinions. For that, you need to take subscriptions, because that will help us do a better job, get better experts, get good regular programs going, and bring in the best writing into the print. So my appeal to you, my dear viewers, is take subscriptions to the print if you have not done, because you will not regret paying for the good journalism we are bringing. So let's go to take those questions from our viewers, Ila. The first one is from Dushyant Rajput. Forgive me, I have to look at the phone, and I'm not being discourteous to anyone, or not even to Ela. Dushyant Rajput says, with high inflation expectations and yields picking up elsewhere, do we see chances of a taper tantrum again?
Well, if the US raises rates, or there are expectations that the US would raise rates, and here that rates would stay low, then the conditions for a taper tantrum get created. But I think that the kind of episode we saw, the taper tantrum that we saw, is not something 2013 is not something that we are likely to see again, because that was completely unanticipated. Remember that that was a response to Bernanke's statement that the monetary policy of the US Fed would go back to normalization then, and that its balance sheet would go back to normalization, not even something that actually happened. So I don't think that we'll see that kind of a shock, because now it won't be that unanticipated as the taper tantrum was.
There is a question from Ashish Arora, and this is a question I see another viewer also had asked in the YouTube chat. Uh, Ashish is asking, equity markets are facing volatility. How is that going to affect the bond market? And we know stock markets have been going only in one direction, mostly up and up and up. Although today they went up and then came back down and closed negative. Uh, the hot money flowing into the equity markets on the one hand, and the bond market being worried about not wanting the rates to grow higher. What is the correlation here, Ila? I mean, again, it's again a complicated correlation.
Yeah, so these I think the only thing that one can say at the moment is that we should expect volatility in both markets, because of the conditions that we are seeing, because of the expectations of higher government borrowing because of expectations of central banks going to pump in liquidity. So, there will be money in equity markets, and any condition in which there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system. Remember that was the problem even before the global financial crisis. That was also the problem after quantitative easing, that there was a lot of money sloshing around in the system, and that money needs to find places to get returns from. And as expectations move from one end to the other, you get people putting in money, pulling out money, expectations keep changing, and that affects prices in both these markets, and you see a lot of volatility. I think at the moment, that is the maximum that one can predict, that these are going to be volatile times with a lot of liquidity sloshing around in the system.
And I had my own one thought, if you can address that also, Ela, is the talk generally of rates going up in the US, and the money flowing back into the US, and the emerging markets, stock markets taking a hit. So it's a constant churn between different parts of the world when it comes to rates and yields.
Yeah, absolutely. We live in a globalized world where money goes in and goes out, and especially, this risk on risk off phenomena is
Mm-hmm.
happening when people feel that if US rates are high, and if because of the conditions in the market they don't want to take risk, then they pull out of emerging markets and money goes back to the US. But then their search for yields, their search for returns, brings them back to emerging economies, because the kind of promises that a lot of pension funds have made to their clients, to pensioners, they don't get those kind of real returns in the US or in in advanced economies. They get them only in emerging economies. So you're always seeing this uh, happening, I think, all the way back to the global financial crisis. Now more than a decade, where this is the uh, dominant thing that plays out in the minds of investors and institutional investors, who behave pretty much like each other. So,
Mm-hmm.
whether it is their money depending on credit rating or sentiments, who often exhibit herd behavior. So it has large impacts in markets, and that's what I think we'll continue to see that for a while.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Next question is from Anubhav Banerjee. Thank you, Anubhav. Uh, would it be difficult to maintain FRBM targets for the next several quarters? Would a fiscal council help to keep the government's expenditure in check?
You see, FRBM, we are way beyond FRBM targets. So we've already decided that we can't be on the 3% path. And currently, the mechanism of FRBM, of the government sticking to FRBM or not sticking to it, is that it puts in a line amending the FRBM in the budget. Okay. And I often say that's, governments have done that, go all the way back to 2004, and year after year after year, you see that governments amend the FRBM, the uh, deficit that it was supposed to have followed. Now, in such a situation, yes, a fiscal council would keep a check on what the government is doing. But I think equally important is a deep and liquid bond market, because who's going to be the client of the fiscal council? Client means the stakeholder, the who is going to be the customer of the fiscal council, who is going to be trying to read and understand and hear and listen to what the fiscal council is saying. I mean, it's not for the government. The government already knows what it is doing. The public, you and I, newspaper readers, are not as much participants in the bond market that it would matter that much. I mean, we know that, okay, the government is not at 3, it's at 4.5. We know, for example, that in before this budget was quite transparent, but before this budget, you used to find a lot of items that were off budget, borrowing by the Food Corporation of India, for example, or by oil companies, which were actually subsidies which would not be paid directly on budget, but the borrowing would be done by other entities. So all this has to be brought out by the Fiscal Council, but the one who will react to what the fiscal council says is a deep and liquid bond market, where again I go back to something that we talked about earlier, where you want an independent debt manager of the government. You want a bond market which has the same market infrastructure, regulator, which brings together the bond and equity and the corporate bond market. So all when there is a vibrant market, that is when a fiscal council would have maximum impact.
Before we go to the next question, there is a comment from Manish, and I would like to thank Manish for his sentiments. Manish Mehrotra says the print is doing an excellent job in terms of unbiased reporting. Great work. Thank you, Manish. We really, really appreciate your sentiments. And so please do spread the word around about the print. Get your friends to watch us and read us, read Ela, watch her videos and the other content we put out there. We need all the support from friends like you. Thank you so much, Manish. Next one, Ela, is from Kaushal Kishore. Kaushal is referring to the recent SEBI directive, which said that mutual funds should value perpetual bonds as 100 years maturity tool, and that he also heard that the markets might panic because of it. Is it not going to cause volatility in the market, and how does one deal with it?
I think any regulations which have an important effect on markets and on market participants should be put out carefully in public domain, stakeholder consultations done, comments taken before any such regulation is adopted. On this one, for example, the market participants will certainly have a view, the regulator will have a view, other regulators would have a view, maybe the government whose bonds are going to be held will have a view. And any decision that SEBI takes or any regulator takes to change a regulation should go through this whole consultation process. I mean, this is not something that I am saying new today, but this is something that the Financial Stability and Development Council has actually adopted as part of the regulation making process. And SEBI as a member of the FSDC, the Financial Stability and Development Council, has agreed to do all of that. I mean, other than the RBI, which doesn't really do much of it, I think the insurance regulator, the pensions regulator, and SEBI have been going through this process. So every single regulation like this, which will affect markets, make it more volatile, just need to be taken through that process fully, so that whatever are its pros and cons are looked at, the negatives reduced, the positives improved, so that you get better regulation making.
Two last questions, Ila. The next one is from Yogendra Sontake. Thank you, Yogendra, for your question. He says stocks are overvalued. So can one move to bonds with the possible rise of interest rates and fall in bond prices? Where does one park money these days?
Yes, so that's the whole challenge. YP and I will not be able to, come up with
Where to park the money?
where you park your money. But that is the challenge that everyone is facing in the world today.
The last question for the day, Ila, is from Raju S. Raju's question is, why doesn't India sell its US bond holdings of $216 billion and raise money? This will also force Indian companies holding US bonds to exchange them with Indian bonds.
Okay, so this notion that foreign exchange bonds can be just sold and that they will not affect either the exchange rate or the country's ability to be resilient to shocks, is a debate that I think goes back to 2004-5, when I think it was then the deputy chairman of the planning commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who talked about how to use, how to so-called, I use the word use in double quotes, India's reserves for infrastructure. Now, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about why we hold forex reserves. When does the government, when does the Reserve Bank buy these reserves? So, first and foremost, uh, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, 99, 2000, RBI started piling up reserves because when the rupee was appreciating, they would buy up dollars. And slowly, we went from almost nothing to a very large kitty of reserves. But even then, the sort of mindset there is when are reserves adequate? The mindset in the minds of a central bank and why they continue holding those reserves is that they should provide one, a certain amount of import cover. That is, usually rule of thumb is that at least 12 months worth of import cover should be held, so that in case there is a crisis, in case nobody wants to give us money, whether it's a nuclear test or any other reason, then we should have money to be able to import our essential requirements. The second rule there is that we should be able to we should be able to repay short-term debt. So it should not be that we default on our debt because we don't have adequate foreign exchange reserves. So that is a second element of the story, that you need to hold reserves, or you decide to hold reserves. Now, all this is done in a situation where you don't want the currency to fluctuate a lot. Of course, I could have argued that yes, we don't hold any reserves, and then if there's a large demand and we are not getting any dollar flows, we can let the rupee depreciate a lot, and that is a ideal solution. So I think there's a whole complexity around why reserves are purchased, why dollar inflows, why dollars are purchased, why they are held, and all that has to do with our currency and exchange rate policy. So, this idea that somehow we are going to be able to go and sell whatever our dollar reserves in we'll have to do that in the forex market, right? And that will affect the exchange rate, and that you are fine with what the impact on the exchange rate is going to be. So you will sell dollars, you will buy rupees, you'll have a huge appreciation of the rupee. What will be the impact on exports, whether they will become competitive or not? Just a very, very complex question. And I think right from the time when Montek raised that question, there has been a lot of debate on why it cannot be done and why the whole idea of doing that was misconceived. And I don't want to go on. I mean, I could speak about this. I've written many papers on this and I could go on for an hour, but we're running out of time. But I would refer you to that debate.
Actually, the next one is the last question, Ila, because it's from a regular viewer, Hitesh Nautiyal. And Hitesh says he's glad to see the two of us. Thank you, Hitesh. We are glad to be back and glad to have you back. I'm sure Ila echoes that sentiment. Uh, Short question. Uh, Ma'am, do you think India will be included in the global bond index? And what are its main advantages?
You would get more. India would be included if if we remove restrictions on a lot of the restrictions that we have on foreign holdings of GSECs. So we've been doing away with those restrictions to a very large extent. We moved from dollar caps to percent caps, and those restrictions have been on their way out. And still we have some way to go, I believe, in terms of how much of convertibility do we allow. Then the question of what does it bring for us? It brings more funds, of course. So when you're part of the index, you are able to raise more money. Sometimes it's also, you get more money, but then there's also more volatility that goes with it, because when you have this risk off situation, then money also flows out very fast. But to be a mature economy, we need to learn to be resilient to volatility, and to be able to live with both inflows, outflows, and flexibility of the currency. And that's really it.
Thank you, Ila. Thanks a lot. I hope it was a very useful session today. It was definitely useful for me because bonds, like I said, are not something we deal with regularly. We are retail, consumers of the financial market, and this is something to do with the larger wholesale players in the financial market. So I hope this one was a very useful session for all of you. We will be back next Friday around the same time for another live session of Economics. Until then, stay safe and keep watching our other videos on the Print YouTube channel.